That President Kennedy felt that all Americans ought to be equal, but unfortunately his assassination is going to pass the torch, so to speak, on civil rights to Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson is a Southern Democrat and had a lot of allies in the South who were not very keen on the black person having equal rights. And so, as I told you before, despite the fact that he probably is blamed for the failures of the Vietnam War more than anything in his presidency, he was without doubt the greatest civil rights president that we ever had, especially in a situation where he has to convince his colleagues in the South the importance of civil rights when they don't believe that's the way it should be. So he had a very tough task, and I give him a ton of credit for what he did for civil rights. Now, during his administration, civil rights is going to be he's going to have two major issues: civil rights and the Vietnam War. He does not have an easy presidency during the 4 years in which he was elected to his own term. And I'm going to give you 6 instances of continued violence during the civil rights problems during the Johnson administration. 6 things that happened during his administration that really caused some problems, some serious issues in that endeavor. The first one we'll talk about is the Freedom Summer Project. Now, the only thing we've talked about civil rights of any impact was the Birmingham situation, right? Where Martin Luther King brought in people to Birmingham. Robert Kennedy had to send in members of the FBI. Even the member of the FBI was beaten, that whole mess. And that's all Kennedy really dealt with during his presidency before he was assassinated. The Freedom Summer Project happened in 1964, and it was the goal of that organization, the Freedom Summer Project, to register as many blacks as possible to vote in the state of Mississippi. Okay? So in 1964, the Freedom Summer Project made preparations to register as many blacks as possible to vote in the state of Mississippi. Now, this was kind of an interesting statistic because they estimated that in the state of Mississippi, probably 50% of the population was black. 50%. But only 5% of Negroes had registered to vote. And they didn't register for several reasons. A lot of it intimidation and threat. But that's why the Freedom Summer Project came to Mississippi, is because they looked at the voting record and said, hey, there's 50% of the people in this state are black, and only 5% of the black people in this state are registering to vote. Now, there were some counties in Mississippi where not one single black person registered to vote. And there were certain counties in Mississippi. Now, the Civil Rights Movement had recruited the volunteers for this Freedom Summer Project, and I want again to emphasize that not all these people were black. Many, sometimes a majority, were white students in college that joined the Civil Rights Movement. So it wasn't only black people. Many hundreds and thousands of white people joined in on the Civil Rights Movement for change in our country. Now, this was kind of an interesting deal because these civil rights leaders all came to Mississippi and they wanted to help the Freedom Summer Project register these blacks to vote, but Martin Luther King Jr. did not attend. He did not attend, which was kind of unusual. Why do you think he did not attend? Kind of like the reasons why some people thought Kennedy shouldn't go to Dallas when he went to Texas. There are a lot of people against Martin Luther King Jr., and Dr. King was advised by his aides not to participate in the Freedom Summer Project for his own safety. Okay? They figured he may be hurt, injured, or maybe even killed if he participated. He was starting to make a few enemies in the civil rights movement. Now, people in Mississippi were not very happy about this Freedom Summer Project at all. And they referred to it as, quote, an invasion of outside agitation. So many Mississippians, all white, obviously, did not look favorably upon the Freedom Summer Project. They viewed it as, quote, an invasion of outside agitation. And as you can imagine, when they came to push this voting rights, violence occurred. Many of the volunteers were beaten. Homes of blacks were burned to the ground. Local churches were damaged and burned. It was just an absolute nightmare. an absolute terrible scene. And the most violent act of the Freedom Summer Project happened on June 21st, 1964. On June 21st, 1964. So despite volunteers being beaten, despite homes of blacks being burnt to the ground, despite the fact that local churches were damaged and burned, the most violent act occurred on June 21st, 1964, when 3 of these civil rights workers went missing. 3 of them went missing. Couldn't find them. 3 civil rights workers went missing. They were Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Earl Cheney. 3 of these civil rights workers that were helping the Freedom Summer Project just all of a sudden went missing in Mississippi. And they were Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Earl Cheney. Now you might think that all 3 of these were black. Well, 2 of the 3 were white. 2 of these 3 civil rights workers were white. Goodman and Schwerner were actually white men from New York City, a long ways from home and the protection of the North. Goodman and Schwerner were white men from New York City, while Cheney was a black man from Mississippi. So Goodman and Schwerner were white men from New York City. Cheney was a black man from Mississippi. Well, their disappearance went on for a month. And after a month had passed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. joined the Freedom Summer Project. He was very, very concerned about how things were going. He was concerned about not much progress being made in Mississippi on voter rights. And he was concerned about these 3 guys being missing. And he thought it was better to be doing something good for the movement than sitting idle. So he joined the Freedom Summer Project, and he gave a speech about the missing men. Gave a speech about the missing men, hoping to find them, hoping to... And what everybody know. I mean, what was the story? These guys, you think these guys are ever coming back? Probably not. And that was probably the thought from the start, that they were killed or murdered. So King comes back and gives a speech about the missing men, hoping for a miracle. Finally, in August of 1964, they found the 3 bodies in an earthen dam. They had been buried in an earthen dam. An earthen dam is simply a dam made of earth that stops water. They had buried them in the bottom of the earthen dam. Murdered them, shot them, and buried them in an earthen dam. Who gave the eulogy for the 3 murdered civil rights workers? Who gave the eulogy? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yep. He gave the eulogy for the 3 murdered civil rights workers. Now, with all the efforts and all the time committed, including the deaths of 3 of their workers, the Freedom Summer Project only resulted in 1,200 new black voters. Not very good. Really kind of a sad story. Well, in the middle of these 6 crises we're going to talk about concerning civil rights, something kind of happens unusual in mid-October of 1964 after the efforts in Mississippi. Anybody want to know what happened concerning Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in mid-October of 1964? Anybody know what happened to him? No, something positive, actually. First of all, he was hospitalized for fatigue. His grueling efforts in the civil rights movement forced him to be hospitalized. And during the time he was recovering, he received news that he had been named the 1964 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. He had been named the recipient of the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize. Does anybody know what the Nobel Peace Prize means? Anybody? Anybody know what the story is on that? Someone that does what? Something admirable to create peace around the world. It's a big, distinct honor. Well, he recovers, and in December, he travels to Oslo, Norway, to receive his Nobel Peace Prize. Big, big honor. So in December of 1964, King travels to Oslo, Norway, to receive his award, and the cash prize that went with it, at the time, $54,000, which would be about $420,000 in today's monies. So King travels to Oslo, Norway, receives the Nobel Peace Prize and the $54,000. What did he do with that money? Anybody know? Anybody want to guess what he did with that $54,000? He gave it back to the civil rights movement in America, never took a penny. Donated all $54,000 back to the civil rights movement in America. Well, he gave a speech when he accepted his award on December 10th of 1964. And here's a sentence from that speech that I think is worth hearing. So on December 10th of 1964, Dr. King received his Nobel Peace Prize, his $54,000, and gave a speech. And this was one of his lines in his speech. I think, if you don't have to write it down, but I think it's worth mentioning. He says, "I accept the Nobel Prize of Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice." So he accepts it on behalf of himself as grateful, but he's not happy that 22 million Negroes are still trying to gain equality in the United States. Okay, our second issue occurred in Selma, Alabama. Anybody watch the movie Selma? It came out maybe a year ago. Okay. Selma, Alabama. Now, this occurred in January of 1965, and Martin Luther King Jr. was right behind this particular movement. And what King wanted to do is turn the attention of civil rights to the state of Alabama. He wanted to concentrate on the state of Alabama. And what he was really looking to do is force the hand of President Johnson to try to get him to pass some legislation that would guarantee the Negro the right to vote. So in January of 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. turns the attention of the civil rights movement to the state of Alabama. And basically what he's trying to do is push President Johnson into passing some sort of legislation or law that would guarantee the Negro's right to vote. They already have the right to vote, don't they? But what's he really want them to guarantee, President Johnson, through law? The ability to register to vote unharassed or unintimidated. Okay? He wants him to put some sort of a voting rights bill into place that guarantees that all blacks can register free of intimidation or violence and exercise their right to vote. Because you cannot vote if you do not register. You have to register to vote, otherwise you lose that privilege. And that was the problem. Now, what King wanted was a law that would make it easier for black people, especially in the Deep South, to register to vote. And so he announced publicly that in Selma, Alabama, it was his intention to register 3 million black voters. And he was going to try to get them all to congregate in Selma and get them registered. 3 million. They got 1,200 the last time they gave this award, right? So his prediction or his goal, in a way, is a little bit out of balance. But that's what he stated. He announced publicly that it would be his intention to register 3 million black voters in the South. And he began this registration where? In Selma, Alabama. Okay? And he expected federal protection while he was doing this. He expected federal protection. Now, the reason that King started in Selma, Alabama on this 3 million black voter registration goal is because Selma was a city that approximately 15,000 black people lived in and virtually no registered voters. 0. 15,000 blacks lived in Selma, and you could count on one hand probably how many had actually registered to vote because of intimidation and violence. So that's why he picked Selma. Well, like I said, Dr. King was expecting federal protection during his crusade to register. Instead, what he got was Selma's sheriff, Jim Clark. Instead of getting federal protection, what he gets is Selma's sheriff, Jim Clark. And he handled these protesters with brute force, which led again to violence. So Selma's Sheriff Jim Clark wants no part of this registration in Selma of the 15,000 blacks that were not registered. And he doesn't provide any protection for King and the civil rights movement there. He provides brute force which leads to violence. Well, King is upset because of the violence on part of law enforcement, so he announces a march for freedom in protest. He announces a march for freedom in protest after the way the civil rights movement is treated by Sheriff Jim Clark. King announces a march for freedom. And the march would begin in Selma, and it was going to end at the steps of the state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, which is about 54 miles away. So in retaliation, so to speak, for the way his civil rights movement is treated while they're trying to register new blacks in Selma, King plans a protest march from Selma, Alabama, to the state capital of Montgomery, Alabama, which is about 54 miles away. So on March 7th of 1965, approximately 6,000 demonstrators left Selma without Dr. King for their march to Montgomery. So on March 7th, 1965, approximately 600 demonstrators left Selma without Dr. King, and they were going to march to the steps of the state capitol of Montgomery. And the reason he didn't go is the same reason he didn't attend the Freedom Summer March, is his aides were afraid of his safety. So he did not attend. Well, these demonstrators didn't make it very far. You know how far they made it? To the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They only made it to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is a landmark bridge in Selma. And who met them there? State troopers stopping their march to Montgomery. So the demonstrators did not make it far before they were stopped by state troopers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, by state troopers who proceeded to trample and beat these people in an event that turned out to be the bloodiest battle of the civil rights movement to that point. Martin Luther King's aides had a point, didn't they, by not letting him march. Those people made it just barely out of town to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They were met by state troopers, Alabama state troopers. They were trampled and beaten in an event that turned out to be the bloodiest of the civil rights movement up to that time. And guess where everybody saw it? On national television. This television has come into being. So this whole scene at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, was aired that evening on national television. Well, if you're Dr. King, what are you going to do? You're going to say, oh, that's okay, we're leaving. He's going to make sure that that march continues and completes. Okay? So he plans another march after the violence. He immediately plans another march. What did the people of Alabama do to prevent that without beating the hell out of everybody this time? What do you do if you don't want somebody to take action or do something? You go get a what? It starts with an I. Federal. It's a document that stops a person's ability to do something until it's ruled on to see if what they're doing is right.
Inquisition?
Close. Injunction. They went and got a federal injunction which barred the march until a ruling could be made on the protesters' right to proceed. Okay? They barred an injunction. That's what an injunction does. Okay? An injunction does not allow you to do what you want to do until it's been decided if it's legal. Now, who's in the background watching all this? Thinking, oh my God. Lbjcr. President Johnson is just going, oh my God. So he pleads with Martin Luther King Jr. to honor the injunction. Do what they ask you to do. Let's get this under control. He pleads with Dr. King to obey the order because he doesn't want any more bloodshed. So, Dr. King and President Johnson have a private conversation about this. And Dr. King states to President Johnson that they will continue their march, but they will cut it short. But the only people know that they're going to cut the march short are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Johnson. His followers do not know this. So instead, Dr. King privately agrees with President Johnson to cut his march short, something he did not even tell his followers. Well, King begins the march again, and this time instead of having 600 people, he has over 2,000 supporters that are ready to march from Selma to the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery. And they walk to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where Martin Luther King led them. They all knelt in prayer. He led them in prayer at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And his followers thought that he would get up from prayer and do what? Continue on. Okay? So King leads a march of nearly 2,000 supporters back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They all kneel in prayer, and to the surprise of his supporters, King simply turns around and marches back into Selma. Turns around and marches back into Selma. Well, on March 15th of 1965, President Johnson delivered a special address to Congress. And what was the topic? Civil rights. This was not a planned speech. This was a special address. Johnson felt like he needed to get on national television and talk to the American people in an address to Congress about the right of